Paul Bernardo. In the spring of 1992, a 15-year-old girl named Kristen French was walking home from school in St. Catharines, Ontario, when a couple in a car asked her for directions. She leaned toward the window to help. She was never seen alive again. What investigators eventually uncovered about that car, the couple inside it, and what happened over the 3 days that followed, would shake the country in a way it had not been prepared for. Bernardo had already been targeting women across the Scarborough suburbs for years before Kristen French disappeared. He had committed at least 14 attacks in that area, earning him the name that haunted the city's headlines. He had also been living with his fiancée, Karla Homolka, a woman whose own role in the crimes would not be fully understood until it was too late to undo the damage. Leslie Mahaffey was 14 years old when she vanished from Burlington on June 15, 1991. She was a young student who had been locked out of her home that night. Her dismembered remains, encased in concrete, were found in Lake Gibson weeks later. Kristen French was abducted from a church parking lot in April of 1992 and held for 3 days before her life was taken. The investigation that followed was long, fragmented, and deeply troubled. Police had investigated Bernardo as a suspect in the Scarborough attacks as early as 1990, taking a DNA sample in November of that year. But that sample sat in a queue at the Center of Forensic Sciences for nearly 2.5 years. By the time it was processed and confirmed as a match, Bernardo had already taken 2 more lives. What nobody knew at the time was that Karla Homolka had approached police in February of 1993, offering to cooperate in exchange for a deal. Prosecutors, working without the most critical evidence, agreed to 2 counts of manslaughter. She received a 12-year sentence. The agreement became known as the Deal with the Devil, and it earned that name for a reason that would only become clear later. Bernardo's lawyer, Ken Murray, had retrieved 6 videotapes hidden inside the couple's home. Tapes that documented Homolka's active and willing participation in the crimes against both victims. Murray held onto those tapes for 17 months before turning them over to prosecutors in September of 1994, after passing the case to lawyer John Rosen. By then, Homolka's deal was already signed. Bernardo went to trial in the spring of 1995. The jury heard evidence that took weeks to present in full. He was convicted on September 1, 1995 of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and of manslaughter in the death of Karla Homolka's younger sister, Tammy. On November 3rd of that same year, he was formally designated a dangerous offender, a classification that reflects an assessment of continuing long-term risk to the public and carries no automatic release date. He spent 18 years at Kingston Penitentiary, reportedly held separate from the general population. When Kingston Pen closed in September of 2013, he was transferred to Millhaven Institution near Bath, Ontario. What does a man do from inside a maximum security cell? In November of 2015, Bernardo self-published a 631-page fictional novel titled A Mad World Order on Amazon, priced at $7.77. It briefly became a bestseller on the platform before being removed amid public outcry. Then came May of 2023. The Correctional Service of Canada quietly transferred Bernardo from Millhaven to La Macasa Institution in Quebec, a medium-security facility. The move ignited national outrage. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino was dropped from cabinet in July of that year as the political fallout continued. A CSC review committee concluded in July of 2023 that the reclassification had followed all applicable laws and policies. Bernardo retained his dangerous offender designation and was still assessed as a high risk to public safety, regardless of the institutional change. He has been denied parole 3 times. At his October 2018 hearing, he stated that what he had done was dreadful, that he had hurt many people and cried about it constantly. The board noted that his apparent empathy seemed to be recent. At his most recent hearing in November of 2024, held at La Macaza, Leslie Mahaffey's mother, Debbie Mahaffey, addressed the board. She told the panel that the greatest and most lasting destruction to her own peace and joy had been, and remained, Paul Bernardo. Her son Ryan, who was 7 years old when his sister was taken, said that Bernardo had effectively stolen both parents through the grief he created. As of the November 2024 parole hearing, Paul Bernardo remains incarcerated at La Macaza Institution at medium security. The families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French have continued to fight, unsuccessfully, through the Federal Court of Appeal, to access his parole records. His dangerous offender designation remains in force. He will not be eligible for release on any automatic basis. The case that followed set the standard for every Canadian conversation about the limits of plea agreements that came after it. For the families left behind, that conversation never really ended. Bruce MacArthur. He delivered holiday gifts to families in his neighborhood. He played Santa Claus at shopping malls during the Christmas season. His clients trusted him with their gardens, their backyards, the quiet spaces around their homes. For years, nobody looked twice at the quiet, heavy-set landscaper from Toronto. That was exactly the problem. Between 2010 and 2017, 8 men connected to Toronto's Church Wellesley Village disappeared. Most were members of, or connected to, the city's LGBTQ community. Police received repeated warnings from community members and advocacy groups that something was wrong, that a pattern existed, that the village was being targeted. The first to disappear was Skandaraj Navaratnam, 40 years old, in September of 2010. Then Abdulbasir Faizi, 44, in December of that same year. The disappearances continued. Majid Kaihan, 58, Sarush Mahmoodi, 50, Dean Lisowick, 47, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, 37, Selim Essen, 44, and then Andrew Kinsman, 49, last seen on June 26, 2017. The entry in Kinsman's calendar for that day read simply, Bruce. Police had actually interviewed MacArthur in November of 2013 during an investigation called Project Houston, which was examining the disappearances of 3 missing men. The detective conducting that interview failed to run a database check that would have revealed MacArthur's 2003 assault conviction involving a man he had met at a gay bar. The probe was shut down in April of 2014, and somehow it gets worse. In December of 2017, Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders publicly stated that there was no serial killer operating in the village. A subsequent independent review would later find that statement to be inaccurate and deeply hurtful to a community that had spent years trying to get someone to listen. The break in the case came after Kinsman's disappearance. Police surveillance caught MacArthur with another man, and they moved. On January 18, 2018, officers entered his Toronto apartment and found a man restrained and bound in his bed. MacArthur was arrested on the spot. What investigators found during the search was extensive in scope. Remains belonging to victims were discovered in large planters at a residential property where MacArthur had worked as a landscaper, and in a ravine on the same grounds. He had kept photographs, organized into 8 digital folders, documenting what he had done to the men he harmed. A 9th folder contained images of the man found in his apartment at the time of arrest. 6 of the victims had been photographically staged after their deaths, posed in fur coats and hats with cigars and ropes around their necks. Justice John McMahon, who presided over the sentencing, described this as MacArthur's perverted form of sexual gratification. How does a city lose 8 people over 7 years before a single person is arrested? MacArthur pleaded guilty on January 29, 2019 to 8 counts of first-degree murder. His sentencing came on February 8. Justice McMahon called him morally bankrupt, a killer who lured his victims and showed no concern for the lives he took. He imposed 8 concurrent life sentences with no parole eligibility for 25 years. MacArthur will be 91 years old at his first possible parole hearing. Crown Attorney Michael Cantlin addressed the courtroom directly, telling those present that for years, the LGBTQ community in Toronto had believed they were being targeted by a killer. They were right. Outside the courthouse, Nicole Borthwick, a friend to several of the victims, was direct about what justice felt like that day. She said there was no closure, no grace, and that the community was broken and would remain broken for a long time. The independent review that followed, known as the Epstein Review or Missing and Missed, was released in April of 2021 under the leadership of retired Judge Gloria Epstein. At over 1,100 pages, it found systemic discrimination had contributed to the investigative failures and contained 151 recommendations. MacArthur was held at Millhaven Institution following his sentencing. On April 11, 2019, he was assaulted there and subsequently hospitalized. The Ontario Provincial Police Penitentiary Squad investigated. As of the most recent available reporting, MacArthur remains incarcerated and serving his sentence. The Correctional Service of Canada does not publicly disclose current institutions for living inmates under the Privacy Act, so his precise location cannot be independently confirmed. What can be confirmed is that he will remain in federal custody for at minimum the next 2 decades, and that 8 families are still carrying what he left behind. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not for 7 years. Dylan Millard, he came from money. Real money. His family operated Millard Air, a well-established Toronto aviation company, and Dylan Millard had grown up with every advantage that implied. He was educated, well-connected, and by his late 20s looked from the outside like a man who had inherited a comfortable life and was living it without complication. What nobody was paying attention to was the body count. Tim Bosma was 32 years old, a husband and father from Ancaster, Ontario. He had listed his pickup truck for sale and, in May of 2013, agreed to take 2 interested buyers out for a test drive. He never came home. His wife Charlene waited. His family waited. Days passed. His remains were found after investigators traced an industrial incinerator called the Eliminator to a farm property connected to Millard. Bosma's body had been burned inside it. The case went to trial. Millard and his co-accused, Mark Smish, were convicted on June 17, 2016 of first-degree murder in the death of Tim Bosma. But the investigation had already uncovered something else entirely. Laura Babcock was 23 years old when she went missing in July of 2012. Before Bosma, she had been connected to Millard romantically, within a situation that also involved his then-girlfriend, Christina Naudga. The Crown's theory was that Babcock had been taken to the same farm property and her body destroyed in the same incinerator. It was never recovered. Millard and Smitch were convicted of her murder in December of 2017. And then there was the third case. Wayne Millard, Dylan's father, was found dead on November 29, 2012, with a gunshot wound through his left eye. His death was initially ruled a suicide. It was later reinvestigated. Phone records placed Dylan's cell at his father's Etobicoke home from approximately 1 in the morning until 6 in the morning on the night Wayne Millard died. The gun used had been purchased by Dellen. Justice Maureen Forrestel, delivering the verdict on September 24, 2018, stated that she was satisfied that Dellen Millard had taken his father's life by shooting him in the left eye. 3 first-degree murder convictions, 3 separate trials, 3 victims across an 18-month span. He received 3 consecutive life sentences, which initially carried a parole ineligibility period of 75 years, then the longest in the Canadian system. That was later reduced, following the Supreme Court of Canada's 2022 decision in R. v. Bissonnette, which struck down consecutive parole ineligibility periods and capped ineligibility at 25 years. How does a man spend his time in maximum security? In Millard's case, he spent some of it organizing an attack on a fellow inmate. On July 11, 2021, at Millhaven Institution, Millard helped to hold Sean Trites in place, while a co-accused named Clayton Sumner stabbed him with a handmade weapon. Trites required emergency cardiac surgery. Millard was convicted of assault causing bodily harm on March 6, 2023, and sentenced to 1 year concurrent with his existing life sentences. That's not a typo, by the way. A man serving 3 life sentences for murder was convicted of an additional violent offense committed inside the prison. In November of 2025, Millard was transferred from Millhaven to Beaver Creek Institution in Gravenhurst, a medium-security facility. The same prison where Mark Smich had been moved years earlier. Tim Bosma's widow Charlene, along with his parents Hank and Mary, released a statement describing their reaction to the transfer. They said they were disgusted. They asked what the point of maximum security was if a man with 3 first-degree murder convictions could be classified as lower risk. Laura Babcock's mother, Linda, said the news took her back to how she felt at the very beginning. As of November 2025, Dellen Millard is incarcerated at Beaver Creek Institution at medium security. The Ontario Court of Appeal upheld all 3 murder convictions, the father's case in March of 2023 and the Bosma and Babcock convictions in June of the same year. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until his 25-year ineligibility period expires. Tim Bosma never came home from a test drive. That fact has not changed, regardless of what prison Dellen Millard wakes up in. Helmuth Buxbaum. He was the kind of man whose public life looked like a model for what hard work could build. Born in East Prussia in 1939, Buxbaum came to Canada around age 19 and over 2 decades built a nursing home empire worth millions, 9 facilities and a private hospital. He was known as a church-going man, a successful businessman, a community figure. Hannah Buxbaum was 48 years old, his wife and business partner of many years. On July 5, 1984, she was shot 3 times in the head on the shoulder of Highway 402 near Kamoka, outside London, Ontario. The shots came after the car she was traveling in was pulled to the roadside. She had not seen it coming. Her last recorded words, heard by a witness as she was pulled from the vehicle, were directed at her husband. "Please, honey, no, not this way." The investigation moved quickly once detectives began examining the financial picture. Buxbaum had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy on his wife shortly before she died. Per reporting from the Globe and Mail, approximately $2 million had also quietly disappeared from a shared bank account in the period leading up to the shooting. The trial that followed stretched to 68 days and produced testimony that painted a portrait entirely at odds with the church-going businessman the community had known. Witnesses testified to cocaine use and a separate private life that bore no resemblance to his public one. How does a man who built 9 care facilities for the elderly end up convicted of ordering a highway ambush on his own wife? The Crown's theory was direct. Buxbaum had paid contract killer Gary Fauché $10,000 to carry out the ambush on that highway. He had pulled his own car to the roadside that day, so the killing could take place. Fauché was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life with no parole for 15 years. The jury in Buxbaum's case deliberated for just 12.5 hours. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced on February 13, 1986, to life with no parole for 25 years. His first lawyer was the late Edward Greenspan, one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in Canadian history. He later retained Clayton Ruby, who pursued an appeal on the grounds that a 1982 stroke had left Buxbaum mentally impaired at the time of the offense. The Supreme Court of Canada refused to hear the case, ending his appeals entirely. Buxbaum also fought a long legal battle to recover a portion of the fees paid to his first lawyer, Edward Greenspan. That bill was suggested to be over $1 million, believed at the time to be the highest legal fee in Canadian history for a criminal defense matter. The courts did not side with him. He was documented at Kingston Penitentiary in 1990 and later held at Warkworth Institution near the end of his life. No independent records confirm a specific placement at Millhaven, and any such claim should be noted with that limitation. The nursing home chain was sold during his trial in 1986 for approximately $22 million. What that money meant to the broader Buxbaum family became its own story. Hannah's family received nothing from the estate in any meaningful sense. The children of the business partners, the residents of 9 nursing facilities, the community that had considered him one of its successful members, all of them were left to make sense of a man who had been building 2 lives simultaneously for years. The family that remained eventually fragmented over disputes concerning the estate. The business he built outlasted the marriage, the trial, and ultimately, the man himself. Helmuth Buxbaum died on November 1st, 2007, at age 68, after being transferred to the Kingston Penitentiary Regional Hospital for unspecified health concerns. He had served more than 20 years of his life sentence and never faced a parole board that released him. The highway outside Komoka still exists. Hannah Buxbaum's last words were spoken on the shoulder of it, addressed to a man who had already decided what was going to happen before they left the house that morning. Ty Khan. Every system produces its own contradictions. The corrections system produced Ty Khan. Ernest Bruce Hayes was born on January 18, 1967, and abandoned by the time he was old enough to understand what that meant. His teenage birth mother left him, then his father, then his grandparents. He was adopted at age 3 by a Belleville psychiatrist, whose home he later described as abusive, and from which he was eventually returned to the care of the Children's Aid Society. He cycled through foster homes, group homes, and youth detention for years. By the time he was 16, he had committed his first bank robbery. What followed over the next 2 decades was almost entirely non-violent in execution. Armed bank robberies carried out with a shotgun in which no one was physically injured. He accumulated more than 30 charges across those years. The sentence that accumulated alongside them eventually reached 47 years. The crimes remained nonviolent throughout. The sentence kept growing regardless. His first escape came in 1989, when he broke free from a guard escort during a medical leave from Millhaven Institution and remained at large for 68 days. In 1991, he scaled the wall at Collins Bay Penitentiary and was captured 2 months later in an Ottawa apartment during a confrontation with police. What do you do with a man who keeps escaping and keeps not hurting anyone when he does? By 1998, he had been transferred from Millhaven to Kingston Penitentiary after doing something unexpected for someone with his history. He had warned Millhaven security that fellow inmates were planning an escape. He was placed in protective custody as a result. On May 6, 1999, Ty Khan went over the wall of Kingston Penitentiary. He had built a homemade ladder and grappling hook in the prison workshop over weeks. He used cayenne pepper to throw off tracking dogs. He left a dummy in his bed. It was the first successful escape over the Kingston Penitentiary wall in approximately 40 years. He remained free for 13 days. During that time, an armed robbery of a CIBC branch in Colborne, Ontario, on May 8 matched his description. He was never charged for it, due to what happened next. On May 20, 1999, police surrounded Ty Khan in a Toronto basement apartment. He was on the phone with a producer from CBC's Fifth Estate, a journalist named Teresa Burke, who had been in contact with him throughout the 13 days he was free. Khan died of a shotgun wound to the chest. The death was ruled a suicide, though the precise circumstances have remained a matter of debate ever since. He was not shot by police. He was 32 years old. Journalist Lyndon McIntyre, who had befriended Khan in 1994 and later co-authored a book about his life, delivered his eulogy. He said that Khan had often told him how badly he felt about the people he had frightened during the robberies. Not harmed, frightened. The book McIntyre and Burke wrote about him, co-authored and published in 2000, was titled Who Killed Ty Khan, and the question in that title was not metaphorical. It pointed at a system that had taken a damaged, abandoned child and responded to his nonviolent crimes with increasing sentences, increasing security classifications, and no apparent mechanism for addressing what had produced him. He warned of an escape. He was moved. He cooperated. He was given protective custody and eventually a prison with a wall he could build a ladder to get over. His case remains one of the more studied examples of what critics describe as the failure of child welfare and correction systems to respond proportionately, and of what happens when the institutional response to nonviolent crime is structurally indistinguishable from the response to something far more severe. As of May 20, 1999, Ty Khan is deceased. He was the only person on this list who never physically harmed anyone. What follows from here is a different kind of story entirely. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Peter Demeter. He was found guilty of ordering the death of his own wife, sentenced to life in prison, and promptly kept scheming. Arson, kidnapping plots, conspiracy charges that accumulated while he was already behind bars. By the time Peter Demeter reached his 80s, he had accumulated what some legal observers counted as 5 concurrent life sentences, most of them earned from inside a federal penitentiary. Most people never heard about this part. Peter Demeter arrived in Canada as a Hungarian refugee following the 1956 revolution and remade himself entirely. By the early 1960s, he was a successful Toronto land developer, living in a large home in Mississauga with his wife Christine, an Austrian-born former model, and their young daughter Andrea, who was 3.5 years old. Christine Demeter was 33 years old. She had a daughter she adored, and a marriage that her husband would later acknowledge was troubled on both sides. On July 18, 1973, she was found bludgeoned in the garage of the family's Mississauga home. Her daughter was inside watching television. Peel Regional Police Detective William Teggart led the investigation. The financial picture that emerged was familiar in outline. A $1 million life insurance policy on Christine's life, and a husband who stood to collect it. What made the Demeter case unusual was the trial that followed, which at the time became the longest in Canadian history at approximately 11 weeks, nearly 17 months after the killing. Demeter's defense team included Edward Greenspan and Joseph Pomerant, two of the most accomplished criminal lawyers in the country. The Crown, however, had a witness the defense could not fully discredit, a former friend named Shaba Siligi, who had secretly recorded conversations with Demeter that strongly suggested he had been arranging Christine's death. A hooded witness referred to only as Mr. X, later identified as Gyula Virag, testified that Demeter had hired a contract killer known by the nickname The Duck. The alleged triggerman, a man named Imre Olejniak, was never located. He reportedly died in Hungary in 1975. Demeter was convicted on December 6, 1974, in London, Ontario, and sentenced to life in prison. What kind of man responds to a life sentence by immediately plotting the next one? What followed was extraordinary in its persistence. In 1983, while incarcerated, Demeter was charged with arson after allegedly paying a former inmate named Tony Preston $8,000 to set fire to the Mississauga home. He was convicted in July of 1985. That same year, he was convicted of conspiring to kidnap and murder a teenage boy, his cousin's son. Then, in 1988, he was linked to an alleged plot targeting the daughter of his own lawyer, Toby Bellman. And no, I'm not making that up. A man already serving a life sentence for having his wife's life taken managed to accumulate multiple additional serious convictions, all of them involving directing violence at others from inside a federal institution. Demeter spent his sentence at Bath Institution, a medium security facility in Ontario, having waived his biannual parole hearings from 1999 onward, apparently conceding that release was not coming. In March of 2019, at age 85, he made his first parole application in 20 years. The board denied it. The panel noted a less than stellar institutional record, pointing to 40 incidents logged between 2013 and 2019, and observed that his documented history of directing others to act on his behalf made him a higher risk than his age alone might suggest. He had suffered a stroke, a heart attack, and 3 separate cancer diagnoses during his decades of incarceration. He changed his will to leave his daughter Andrea $1. As of the most recent available reporting through 2024, Demeter was still alive and in his 90s, incarcerated in Ontario. His precise date of death, if he has passed, has not been confirmed by any primary source available for this script. Any claim that he has died should be independently verified before repeating it. The Mississauga home he allegedly tried to burn down, the teenager he allegedly tried to have taken, the lawyer's daughter, the contracts arranged through prison walls. Peter Demeter's story is not the story of a man who accepted what had happened to him. It is the story of a man who never stopped. Hamed Shafia. On the morning of July 1, 2009, a maintenance worker at the Kingston Mills locks of the Rideau Canal noticed a car submerged in the water. When police arrived, they found 4 people inside. A father, a mother, and their 3 daughters had reported the car stolen the night before, filing a claim that a family vacation had ended in tragedy when the vehicle slipped into the water by accident. What the investigation found was something else entirely. The 4 victims were Zainab Shafia, 19, Sahar Shafia, 17, Geeti Shafia, 13, and Rona Amir Mohammed, who was between 50 and 52 years old and was the first wife in Patriarch Mohammed Shafia's polygamous marriage. The family had emigrated from Afghanistan, living through years in Pakistan, Australia, and Dubai, before settling in Montreal in 2007. The surviving family members who reported the loss were Hamed Shafia, then 21, his father Mohammed Shafia, 58, and his mother Tuba Mohammed Yahya, 42. Their account was that the car had gone into the water during the night, a terrible accident on a family trip home to Montreal from Niagara Falls. No one else had been present. The physical evidence did not support that story. Investigators found evidence that the family's Lexus had been used to ram the Nissan Sentra into the locks. Laptop searches recovered from a computer used most frequently by Hamed included searches for bodies of water and, in a detail that stopped investigators cold, searches for where to commit a murder. Wiretap recordings captured Mohammed Shafia speaking about the dead women in deeply contemptuous terms, calling them whores and treacherous. His words about the 4 people found in the canal made clear that whatever grief he had displayed in public, something very different existed in private. The prosecution alleged that the 4 women had been targeted because they had, in the family's view, brought dishonor through their relationships, clothing choices, and resistance to the family's authority. Gidi Shafia was 13 years old. She had reportedly sought help from a school counselor and from child welfare authorities before her death. If a 13-year-old girl had asked 2 separate adult institutions for help, and neither had been able to intervene in time, what does that say about the systems that were supposed to protect her? All 3 defendants went to trial together. All 3 were convicted on January 29, 2012, on 4 counts of first-degree murder, after the jury deliberated for approximately 15 hours. Each received an automatic life sentence with no parole eligibility for 25 years. Ontario Superior Court Justice Robert Moranger, at sentencing, told the 3 convicted that it was difficult to conceive of a more heinous, more despicable, more honorless crime, and that their notion of honor had absolutely no place in any civilized society. Prosecutor Gerard Larhuis, speaking outside the courthouse, addressed what the verdict had confirmed, that 4 women, vivacious and freedom-loving, had been taken by their own family. All 3 defendants maintained their innocence at sentencing. Mohammed Shafia, speaking through a translator, said that he and his family were not criminals and not murderers. Tuba Mohammed Yahya said the same. Hamed Shafia subsequently pursued an appeal on multiple grounds, including a fresh evidence motion arguing that he had actually been 17 at the time of the offense and should have been tried as a youth. The Ontario Court of Appeal dismissed both the convictions and the fresh evidence motion on November 2, 2016. The Supreme Court of Canada declined to hear his further appeal in 2017. As of the most recent available information, Hamed Shafia and his parents are each serving their life sentences in federal custody. Their 25-year parole ineligibility periods run from the date of sentencing in 2012, making them eligible for parole consideration at the earliest in 2037. Kingston, Ontario, is where the locks still stand. The canal still runs through the city. The case became one of the most discussed in Canadian legal history, not only for the verdict, but for what the prosecution of it required investigators to document about a family's interior life. Wayne Bowden. The cufflink was the size of a small coin. It was found under Elizabeth Ann Porteous's body on May 18, 1971, in her Calgary apartment. A teacher, 33 years old, dead after being attacked in her home. Witnesses had seen her earlier in the evening with a man near a blue Mercedes. Police had almost nothing to work with. What they did have was that cufflink and the marks on her body. What those marks would eventually establish changed the science of criminal investigation in North America. Wayne Clifford Bowden was born in Dundas, Ontario in 1948 and had worked variously as a model and salesman before investigators placed him in Calgary. He was known as presentable, charming, and unremarkable in the way people often describe men who later turn out to be something else entirely. The 3 Montreal victims came first. Shirley Odette was found on October 3, 1969. Marielle Archambault on November 23 of the same year. Marielle had been a 20-year-old jeweler's assistant. She had disappeared from work and was found the following day. John Way was found on January 16, 1970. All three had been attacked in similar circumstances. All three bore similar evidence of what had been done to them. The cases shared a signature that investigators recognized but could not yet connect to a face or a name. Montreal police had an open investigation, 3 victims, and no suspect in custody. The city did not know that the man responsible had simply left. Bowden had left Montreal by the time Elizabeth Porteous was found in Calgary. The cufflink recovered at the scene was traced back to him. Witnesses who had seen the blue Mercedes helped confirm his identity. He was arrested. How do you convict a man of a crime when the physical evidence amounts to marks on a body and a piece of jewelry found at the scene? What happened next was a first in the legal history of North America. Calgary orthodontist Gordon Swan examined the bite marks on Elizabeth Porteous and compared them directly against Bowden's dental impressions. He identified 29 specific points of similarity. This was the first time in North American legal history that bite mark evidence had been used to secure a murder conviction. The case would later be referenced in discussions of the Ted Bundy prosecution, which relied on the same forensic technique years afterward. Bowden was convicted of Elizabeth Porteous's death and sentenced to life in prison. He was then returned to Montreal, where he confessed to the 3 killings in that city and received 3 additional life terms. He began serving his sentence at Kingston Penitentiary on February 16, 1972. 5 years into his sentence, in 1977, something happened that underscored the nature of who they were dealing with. American Express granted him a credit card while he was incarcerated. Bowden used it during a day pass, slipped out through a restaurant bathroom window in downtown Montreal, and was recaptured several days later. That's not a typo, by the way. His home institution in the years before his death was the medium-security Bath Institution in Ontario. Near the end of his life, he was transferred to Kingston Penitentiary's regional hospital. Wayne Bowden died of natural causes at Kingston Penitentiary in late March of 2006, at approximately 57 or 58 years of age, having served 34 years. He maintained throughout his sentence that he had not been responsible for the 1968 death of a woman named Norma Vaillancourt, a case for which another man had been convicted in 1994. The bite mark forensic method that Bowden's case established has since been critically examined by scientists and legal scholars, with many experts questioning its reliability as evidence. Bowden's own conviction was never challenged on those grounds, and he died without any reconsideration of his case being pursued. A cufflink the size of a small coin, found beneath a teacher's body in Calgary in 1971, produced one of the most significant pieces of forensic precedent in North American criminal law. The man it identified had already been doing what he did in Montreal for nearly 2 years before anyone found him. Michael Wayne McGray. He told detectives after his arrest that he wished he could say he felt bad for the people whose lives he had taken. He couldn't. He said there was no emotion at all. McGray was not performing indifference for the cameras. He described his compulsion to harm others the way someone might describe a hunger. Persistent, growing, eventually impossible to ignore. He said he could not control it anymore. He also said that half of the satisfaction came from remembering the details afterward. Michael Wayne McGray was born on July 11, 1965 in Collingwood, Ontario, and raised in Argyll, Nova Scotia. He described a childhood defined by violence at home from an alcoholic father and further harm at a reform school. He told investigators he had begun harming animals as a child, and that an obsession with serial killer case files had followed. His first documented victim was Elizabeth Gale Tucker, 17 years old, a hitchhiker on May 1, 1985 near Weymouth, Nova Scotia. He was 18 years old. What followed over the next 13 years was a series of offenses across multiple provinces. A cab driver named Mark Gibbons was taken during a robbery in St. John in 1987. In March of 1991, while on a prison weekend pass, Maigret was in Montreal's gay village when two men, Robert Asseli and Gaetan Ethier, lost their lives. He was inside the correctional system at the time. He was on a supervised pass, and he still managed to take 2 lives during it. That detail says something important about the gap between what the classification system understood about Maigret and what he actually was. In February of 1998, a woman named Joan Hicks and her 11-year-old daughter Nina were found in Moncton. Maigret pleaded guilty to Joan Hicks's death in March of 2000. He initially denied taking the child's life, but later admitted it, telling investigators the girl had been harmed fatally to eliminate a witness. Forensic evidence supported the confession. After his arrest in 1998, Maigret began making additional confessions. He told police and reporters that he had taken more lives across Canada and the United States. He made demands for concessions in exchange for the information: psychiatric treatment, immunity for 2 alleged accomplices, improved prison conditions. Investigators and Crown prosecutors declined to negotiate. A 60-day psychiatric evaluation was conducted. Assessors reported a severe form of Tourette syndrome and documented that Maigret believed his urge to harm was neurologically driven. He was sentenced to life with no parole for 25 years, carrying 7 life sentences. He will be approximately 72 years old at his first parole eligibility. What do you do with someone who tells you explicitly and repeatedly that the system's assessment of his risk is wrong? In November of 2010, while held at Millhaven Institution in British Columbia, a medium-security facility to which he had been transferred from Kent Institution, Maigret took his cellmate Jeremy Phillips's life. Phillips was 33 years old. He had reportedly asked guards to be moved to a different cell because he feared Maigret. The request was not accommodated. After the death, Maigret told investigators directly. He did not understand why they had made the mistake of placing him in a medium-security institution. He said he was not a medium inmate. He was transferred following that incident to the Special Handling Unit at Ste-Anne-des-Plaines in Quebec, the closest thing Canada has to a super-maximum facility. He has been formally designated a dangerous offender. In July of 2019, Maigret was publicly identified as a suspect in the 1995 death of a Nova Scotia woman named Brenda Way. Glenna Sown had been convicted of that killing, spent nearly 17 years in prison for it, and was exonerated in 2019. The case against Sown was found to have been deeply flawed. Maigret has not been charged in that death. As of the most recent available reporting, Maigret is serving his sentences in maximum custody. His Ste-Anne-des-Plaines placement is documented. A specific, currently verified Millhaven placement could not be confirmed independently, and any direct claim of his current Millhaven residence should be attributed to last documented information rather than a confirmed present-day fact. He described it as a hunger. The men who built the classification system he moved through for decades thought medium security could contain it. Jeremy Phillips paid for that miscalculation. Omar Khadr. He was 15 years old when the firefight happened. That single fact has been at the center of every legal proceeding, every political argument, and every court filing in the more than 2 decades since. On July 27, 2002, in the village of Ayub Kale in Afghanistan. United States forces engaged a compound believed to house al-Qaeda operatives. Qadr, who had been brought to Afghanistan by his father, was present. His father, who Canadian authorities had described as having ties to al-Qaeda, was killed in the battle. Qadr himself was severely wounded. He was found at the site after the fighting ended. U.S. Army Sergeant First Class Christopher Spear died from wounds sustained in that engagement. A grenade had been thrown from within the compound. Sergeant Lane Morris was blinded in one eye. Qadr was captured, held at Bagram Air Base, and transferred to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where he became the youngest detainee held there and would remain for a decade. Can a child be tried as a combatant for actions taken in a war zone under his father's authority? And can a guilty plea entered in a military prison after years of detention carry the same weight as one entered freely? In October of 2010, following years of legal proceedings before a United States military commission, Qadr pleaded guilty to 5 charges, including murder in violation of the laws of war. He accepted an 8-year sentence, with the understanding that he could seek transfer to Canada after 1 year. He later stated publicly that he had pleaded guilty not because the account was accurate, but because it was the only available path out of Guantanamo. He was repatriated to Canada on September 29, 2012, and held briefly at Millhaven Institution before being transferred to Edmonton Institution in May of 2013, then to Bowden Institution, a medium security facility, in February of 2014. He was reclassified to minimum security in April of 2015. In May of 2015, the Alberta courts granted him bail pending appeal of his United States conviction. He was released. The Supreme Court of Canada had ruled in 2010 that Canadian officials had violated Qadr's rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms by interrogating him at Guantanamo and sharing that information with U.S. authorities. The court described the officials' conduct as offending the most basic Canadian standards. On July 7, 2017, the federal government issued a formal apology and a financial settlement. The settlement amount was widely reported as 10.5 million Canadian dollars, a figure confirmed by sources to the Globe and Mail, though the government kept the official number confidential. The apology was issued jointly by Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale and Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, with Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould present. The settlement became intensely politically divisive. Sergeant Spear's widow, Tabitha Spear, and Lane Morris had sought to enforce a United States default judgment against Qadr in Canadian courts. The federal government moved to settle in part to prevent that enforcement proceeding from succeeding. On March 25, 2019, Alberta Chief Justice Mary Moreau ruled that Qadr's sentence had been fully served, crediting his time spent on bail toward the remaining period. All remaining conditions were lifted. His lawyer, Nathan Whitling, stated that there was nothing further for his client to serve. As of 2026, Omar Qadr is a free man in Canada. He has no criminal restrictions remaining. His United States war crimes conviction appeal has remained effectively stalled and unresolved. The central question his case raised, whether a 15-year-old brought to a conflict zone by a parent could be fairly held criminally responsible as an adult for actions taken within that conflict, is one that legal scholars and human rights organizations continue to discuss. He was 15 years old. That fact sits at the beginning of everything that followed. Whether it changes the weight of those events is a question this video does not answer, and should not. The 10 men in this video represent decades of investigations, trials, appeals, and parole hearings. Their victims represent lives that were interrupted and families that were permanently changed. The institutions that hold them and the legal system that put them there continue to carry the weight of those stories. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.